Jimmy Fallon hadn't asked his first question yet when Steve Martin leaned forward and said, "I need to say this. This is my last talk show." The studio went completely silent. March 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Tuesday night taping. The audience had been loud, excited, buzzing with that electric energy that comes from seeing a living legend walk onto a late-night stage. Steve Martin had entered to thunderous applause wearing an elegant dark suit, his signature white hair perfectly styled, that familiar bemused smile on his face. He'd waved to the crowd, hugged Jimmy, and settled into the guest chair with the ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times over 5 decades. The applause was still fading when he spoke. "I need to say this. This is my last talk show." Jimmy's hands froze on his blue cue cards. His smile flickered, uncertain whether this was set up for a joke. Steve Martin was a master comedian. Maybe this was a bit. But Steve's face wasn't performing. It was serious. Gentle, but serious. The audience didn't know whether to react. A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, quickly dying when Steve didn't smile back. "I'm serious, Jimmy," Steve continued, his voice steady and quiet. "After tonight, I won't be doing television interviews anymore. I wanted you to be the last one. And I wanted to explain why." Jimmy set the cue cards down slowly. The show's format, the jokes, the games, the planned segments, suddenly felt irrelevant. "Steve, Jimmy's voice was hoarse. "Are you okay?" "Is everything?" "I'm fine," Steve said, and there was something like peace in his eyes. "Actually, I'm better than fine. That's what I want to talk about." The cameras stayed locked on both of them. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering into headsets. This wasn't in the show notes. This wasn't planned. But everyone understood instinctively. Keep rolling. Steve adjusted his position in the chair, crossing one leg over the other, his hands folding calmly in his lap. He looked at Jimmy like they were the only two people in the room. "How old are you, Jimmy?" 49, Jimmy answered. "I'm 78, Steve said. "And 3 weeks ago, I became a great-grandfather." A warm murmur rippled through the audience. Jimmy smiled, genuine happiness breaking through his confusion. "Steve, that's wonderful. Congratulations." "Thank you." "Her name is Caroline. 7 pounds 4 ounces. She has my daughter's eyes and, according to my granddaughter, my sense of humor, which is terrifying." Steve paused, his expression shifting to something deeper. "They let me hold her in the hospital. And when I looked at her face, I realized something." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. "She has no idea who I am." Jimmy started to speak, but Steve gently raised a hand. "She doesn't know about The Jerk. She doesn't know about Saturday Night Live or Father of the Bride or King Tut or any of it. To her, I'm just this old man whose hands shake a little when he holds her. And you know what? That's perfect. That's exactly how it should be." Steve's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it, not sadness, but something like relief. "For 55 years, I've been Steve Martin the comedian. Steve Martin the actor. Steve Martin the banjo player. Steve Martin the guy on talk shows telling stories and making people laugh. And I loved it. I loved every minute." He looked directly at Jimmy. "But I don't want to be that person anymore." "What do you want to be?" Jimmy asked softly. "Just Steve," he said simply. "Just a great-grandfather who can spend his mornings with Caroline without worrying about interview schedules or press tours. Just a husband who can have breakfast with his wife without thinking about the next project. Just a guy who plays banjo in his living room because he wants to, not because there's an album deadline." The audience was revitalized. Several people were wiping their eyes. The Roots had put down their instruments, listening like everyone else. 3 weeks ago in that hospital," Steve continued, "holding Caroline, I felt something I haven't felt in decades. I felt anonymous. I felt free. And I realized I want more of that. I want to be nobody again before it's too late. Jimmy's eyes were glistening. Steve, you could never be nobody. You've given so much to. That's kind of you. Steve interrupted gently. But you're young. You don't understand yet. When you're my age, you realize that fame is it's just noise. Beautiful noise sometimes, but noise. And what I want now is silence. I want to watch Caroline grow up. I want to teach her to play banjo when she's old enough. I want to take walks with my wife without people asking for selfies. I want to read books I've been putting off for 30 years. I want to be boring. He smiled, and it was the most genuine smile Jimmy had ever seen on his show. And I can't do that if I'm still showing up on talk shows. Because every interview, every appearance, it keeps me in that world. It keeps me being Steve Martin the performer instead of Steve the great-grandfather. So I'm choosing to stop. Jimmy nodded slowly, struggling to maintain composure. Why me? Why make this your last interview? Because you're kind, Steve said without hesitation. You've always been kind. I've done dozens of talk shows over the years, and most hosts are trying to get something from you, a good story, a viral moment, something they can use. But you've never felt like that. You've always felt like you actually cared about the person, not just the celebrity. Jimmy's hand went to his face, wiping his eyes. I do care. I've always. Your work has meant so much to me. I know, Steve said. That's why I wanted to do this here. I wanted my last interview to be with someone who would understand. Someone who wouldn't try to talk me out of it or make it about ratings. Someone who would just let me say goodbye. The silence stretched. Jimmy wasn't even trying to maintain his host persona anymore. He was just a guy sitting across from his hero, processing what was happening. What Jimmy didn't know was that Steve Martin had been carrying a letter in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks. A letter written by his great-granddaughter's parents, asking him to be present for her childhood the way he couldn't be for his own daughters. Steve reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. It was slightly worn, like it had been handled many times. Can I read you something? Steve asked. Jimmy nodded, not trusting his voice. Steve opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a handwritten letter. He unfolded it, his hand steady despite his age. This is from my granddaughter Emma, Caroline's mother. She wrote it the day after Caroline was born. He cleared his throat and began reading. Dear Grandpa Steve, thank you for coming to the hospital so quickly. Thank you for holding Caroline and crying happy tears and telling us she's perfect. I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why. Will you be here for her? Not Steve Martin the celebrity. Just Grandpa. Just the man who plays silly songs and tells bad jokes and shows up for school plays and birthday parties. Caroline will grow up knowing your movies and your work, everyone does. But I want her to know you. The real you. The one who isn't performing. If that means you have to step away from the spotlight, I'll support you. We all will. But please, Grandpa. Be here. Be nobody. Be everything. Love, Emma. Steve folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. I read that letter sitting in the hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning while everyone slept. And I realized Emma was right. I've spent 55 years being somebody. Maybe it's time to spend whatever years I have left being nobody for the people who actually matter. Jimmy couldn't speak. He was crying openly now, and he didn't care. Half the audience was crying. Questlove had his face in his hands. So that's why this is my last talk show, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion but steady with conviction. Not because I'm sick. Not because I'm bitter or tired or angry at the industry. But because my great-granddaughter needs a great-grandfather more than the world needs another Steve Martin interview. He paused, then added with a small smile. And honestly, I think the world has had enough of me anyway. Never, Jimmy said, his voice breaking. We could never have enough of you. That's sweet, Steve said. But it's not true. Everything has a season. And my season as a public person is over. I'm ready for the next one. Jimmy wiped his face with both hands. What will you do? Besides being with Caroline? I'll play banjo. I'll write, not for publication, just for me. I'll learn to paint, which I've always wanted to do but never had time. I'll take my wife to all the places we always said we'd visit someday. I'll be a regular at my local diner. I'll become that guy people vaguely recognize but can't quite place. He laughed softly. I'm looking forward to that, actually. Being almost famous sounds delightful. The audience laughed through their tears, that perfect combination of joy and sadness that only happens when something truly real occurs on television. Jimmy looked down at his cue cards, then pushed them aside entirely. I had all these questions prepared. Funny stories about your career, clips from your movies, a game we were going to play. But none of that seems right now. No, Steve agreed. It doesn't. Can we just talk? Just you and me? I'd like that. And for the next 40 minutes, far longer than any planned segment, far longer than producers wanted, longer than any guest had ever been given, Steve Martin and Jimmy Fallon just talked. Not as celebrity and host. As two people. They talked about fatherhood and time and legacy and what it means to know when to stop. They talked about Steve's daughter and how he missed so much of her childhood because of his career. They talked about Jimmy's daughters and his own fears about balancing work and family. The formal interview structure disappeared entirely. No games. No clips. No viral moments manufactured for social media. Just conversation. Just truth. At one point, Steve pulled out his phone and showed Jimmy a photo of Caroline sleeping. Jimmy leaned in, studying the image like it was sacred. She's beautiful, Steve. She is. And in 10 years, she won't care that I was in the Three Amigos. She'll only care whether I showed up to her soccer games. Will you? Every single one, Steve said. That's the plan. Eventually, much later than scheduled, with producers making frantic signals from off-camera, the interview had to end. Jimmy didn't want it to. Steve didn't want it to. The audience didn't want it to. But endings are part of the deal. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Jimmy stood, and Steve stood with him. Instead of the usual handshake or hug, Jimmy walked around the desk and embraced Steve like family. They stood there for several seconds while the audience gave a standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like gratitude. When they pulled apart, Jimmy said something that the microphones barely caught. Thank you for making me your last. Thank you for understanding why you had to be. Steve replied. Steve Martin walked off the Tonight Show stage for the last time, waving once to the crowd, and disappeared behind the curtain. The show went to commercial. Jimmy sat at his desk, not speaking, tears still on his face. The audience remained standing, still applauding, even though Steve was gone. When they came back from commercial, Jimmy didn't do another segment. He just looked into the camera and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Martin. The last time. Thank you, Steve. For everything." Then he went to commercial again, ending the show 20 minutes early. The planned segments didn't happen. Nobody cared. 3 months later, Jimmy received a package at the studio. Inside was a photograph of Steve Martin sitting on a porch, holding baby Caroline. On the back, in Steve's handwriting, "Being nobody. Being everything. Thank you for letting me say goodbye. Steve!" Jimmy had it framed and hung it in his office. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, March 19, 2024. The last interview. Steve Martin never did another talk show. He kept his promise. He became Grandpa Steve, anonymous, present, free. And on Tuesday mornings he plays banjo in his living room while Caroline sleeps in the next room, and nobody in the world knows about it except the people who matter.